Hello Seawolves and welcome back to the show. Special episode today. Throughout the race I've been getting a lot of comments and emails from people essentially all asking the same question, but in various different ways, which is, if I kind of summarize it all together, Flo, we have the Vendee Globe race, arguably the toughest, longest race in the world. And as far as technology, money, thinking, going into what the teams are doing, it is also the absolute cutting edge of everything that you could say humanity is doing. It's a bit like space flight, right? Like is a Vendee Globe as hard as going to space? I think completing a Vendee Globe in many ways you could say is, right? So we use cutting edge materials, cutting edge design, cutting edge foods. Everything, every aspect of this race is, created by really the best thinking. And many of the teams, as you know, have had many years to prepare, right? So if it's your first Vendee Globe, then you got 4 years to prepare. But many of the skippers, many of the teams have been doing this race, 3 or 4 times. So they've had arguably, nearly 20 years, for example. I mean, Jean Le Cam, this is like his 6th race, I think. So he's had like a lot of years to, be able to kind of make the perfect preparation for this race. And so in essence, what you guys are asking is, Flo, with all this preparation, with like the best science, millions of euros invested in the best materials, the best production techniques, like the best of everything, how is it possible that we still have so much stuff, and there's so much simple stuff, just breaking, just getting destroyed, just not working in this race? Hull splitting, last time we had a boat breaking in two, masts breaking, sail hooks giving in, sails ripping, etc. There's just breakage all over the place, right? Unexpected things happening all the time to all the teams. And so I told you guys, like, this is actually a very, maybe much more fundamental question than some of you guys think, or gets at the fundamentals very closely. And I said, hey, I think actually I have maybe a very interesting perspective on answering this particular question, but it's going to be quite a long and sort of a bit complicated to explain this to you, to kind of show you why this happened, really exactly, to answer this really in a very good way. So I'm going to make it into, do you want me to make it into a separate episode and really take my time explaining this? And so I asked you guys this, and my email exploded and the comments exploded on that episode, like, yeah, do it, explain it. So that is this episode, right? And it's very important to me, as it is with all the episodes. Like, we have a very broad audience, from very scientific people, engineers watching this, I know, to families with young kids watching this. And so what's very important to me is that that's why I took a little bit of time to make this video, is that I want to structure this argument in such a way that hopefully, most, if not all of you, no matter your level of scientific schooling or thinking, let's say, can ultimately follow my argument. Nice. And understand this really very, very complicated thing that I'm going to try to explain to you. And it's the type of very complicated thing that once you get it, like once you see what I'm going to try to show you, it's very obvious. You're going to be, wow, why haven't I really, seen this before? It's so obvious. But it's one of those, kind of obvious things that often happens, that is like very complicated to see for the first time. But once you get it, it's very, it predicts a lot, and it's very, very sort of mind-baffling to see and to sort of ask yourself, like, why did I never kind of realize this before, right? And so that's what I'm going to try to do today. That's what this episode is about. It's about answering your questions, which I'm going to summarize. So I'm going to kind of take all your questions and summarize it into one question, which will go something along the lines of, why having the best technology that money can buy, the best insights, the best designs, etc., do we still get stuff breaking, stuff failing, etc. Another way of saying it would be, how is it that, like with the best materials and everything, it's even possible that we have so much breakages and failures and, different unexpected things happening of that kind, right? Some of you were even angry in the comments, sort of saying, how is it, like, how stupid, didn't they think about this? Sort of that's the attitude that some of you have sort of shown towards this thing, which I can kind of understand, right? so that you're like watching it and almost feel the frustrated for the skippers of like, how could someone not have thought about this earlier, right? Okay, so in order to structure, like show you what I'm going to try to show you, we first have to, I think, sort of get some common ground, right? Especially for those of you who are kind of university schooled or who are scientists or engineer, I think it's important to kind of start from the same page. So I want you to check for yourself if you believe, if you think what I'm about to show you first. I'm going to sort of tell you something and then check for yourself, like, is this your fundamental assumption? This is your fundamental way of how you view this particular thing also, because that's, I think, important to show for contrast. So the idea is something like this. Check for yourself. So we have discovered, in engineering and science, several, what we call laws or rules. They are essentially structures, right? Like Einstein's law of relativity, or Newton's laws of motion, or the laws of thermodynamics, right? These are structures, we can express them in mathematical equations, you can write them as a story, but they're essentially structures that we discovered, right? And they work extremely well. So they are, in essence, what makes something like the Vendee globe possible, right? That allows us to make materials and design things, because we're using kind of the predictions that these structures, that these models make to keep continuously improving things, right? And one thing that kind of happens quite a bit in this race is that I'm always sort of joking and kind of sort of focusing a little bit, or like reminding people as we're doing the show every day, that weather models, whether they're short term, long term, are very bad, right? Like, or the race models where we kind of predict how fast boats will go and stuff based on their hull shapes and things like that. Like, you're constantly forced to sort of see that they don't quite work, right? And so a central argument that a lot of the scientists and engineers have been making to me in the comments, and sometimes people, sending me long emails about this, where they're essentially saying to me, Florian, you're wrong. Because the reason that those predictions keep breaking down, the reasons that things aren't working out the way that, for example, a weather model predicts something, is because we don't know everything about the initial state. We don't have enough information about the initial state. Now, for the non-science people, the initial state is kind of a bit hard to understand, but essentially what it means is, so the laws, the structures, of science that, all the engineers and all the scientists use, like the laws of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics, they are very precise. Like, the predictions that they make are very, very accurate, right? To the point where we say, like, it's true. If you do A plus B, you always get C, right? Always. And so they're so precise that if we were to know everything about the weather, for example, so if I took the entire planet and we knew where all the clouds were, we knew the temperature of every air molecule and every sea molecule, and we knew, the amount of movement and the amount of energy in everything, and we would put that into a giant supercomputer that just has the laws of physics in it, then we could actually make a perfect prediction of everything that's going to happen from now into the future. If we have exactly the knowledge of like a snapshot of right now, then the laws of science, let's call them collectively, are so precise that we can make an endless prediction into the future. This is the fundamental assumption that basically all scientists or all engineers kind of believe, right? It's what they kind of know, because these laws are so precise, they're so good, that this is an assumption, let's say, that everybody has, right? And there are some limitations people do see because of like chaos math and chaos theory. I'm not talking about that specifically, but bar for that, the predictions that we could make are perfect. I have had several, for example, client scientists email me, say, look, Fleur, the only reason that climate models are not exactly precise is just we can't know everything about the initial state. That's why, there's a lot of variation in like all the different models and stuff. But and the assumption is that if we knew the initial state, then their predictions would be perfect or near perfect, right? And so what I'm going to try to prove to you is that there's a fundamental flaw in an assumption that lies underneath that, right? And so park this idea, like check for yourself, is that what you generally believe? Especially if you're like university school or if you're like an engineer or scientist, like ask yourself for a minute, like check if true. Do you fundamentally believe that, taking the combined laws of science, as an example, I just say, gravity, thermodynamics, laws of motion, Einstein's relativity. If we apply those, we have like very great ability. The more we know about the initial state, of course, the better the predictions, but that generally is true, right? Okay, let's park that over here for a minute. We'll get back to that. Now, I want to make a step towards the world of art, because where my thinking comes from, this is kind of important to know, I'm an art dealer, right? Some of you don't know this, people who saw the first season of Seawolves know this. I sell art, right? For the last 10 years, I've been selling sculptures, paintings from like lots of artists all over the world. So I work with a lot of like cutting edge material science, because art is also very creative and curious, and artists are always exploring like the newest techniques for, building different things and stuff. So that's one side of my life that I'm like very exposed to. On the other hand, I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. So I've mostly worked in education, but very specifically in knowledge structure. So I have a very high understanding of like how to structure knowledge, if that makes sense, and how to take knowledge structure and transfer them from one brain to another. That's kind of what I'm doing right now, right? So that's one of my particular specialties. But I've also had several companies that actually build stuff. So I've had my own instrument brand, for example, where I designed and built saxophones, myself, from the material science to the tonal science. So I also have actually a very specific understanding about some of the engineering aspects that go into that, right? So it's kind of a broad series of a few like kind of odd specialties kind of mixed together, which makes up my perspective, which is how I got to what I'm going to try to sort of show you today, right? So that's kind of good to know. Now, I don't particularly make art myself. I only do it every once in a while, but I don't actually actively show or sell my own artworks. Like in order for you to get an artwork of mine, would have to be extraordinarily exceptional, because I always put them in my own house and kind of make them for myself. And the only way you could get them is if you would like be in my house and just notice something that I recently made and make me a really crazy offer to buy something, and then you could buy it, right? So today I'm going to show you one of my artworks that actually not is made, like it's a very rare thing that I'm still kind of thinking about. So it's not even in the state that I actually made it, but I'm going to show it because it will help me to actually explain something, funny enough. Because I was thinking about how to structure this argument, and to explain what I'm about to explain is very tricky, so I hope it will work with this. And so if you follow me into the screen here, you will see kind of like, this is just the design, but it's basically a structure made out of gold leaf, just a flat artwork, which, as you can see, there is some letters in there, right? And of course, letters are just a structure, right? It's a system, it's symbolism, it's shapes that altogether make other shapes that we kind of can understand as meaning, right? We use them to transfer information from one person to the next. Now, if we kind of walk past this artwork, if you saw it hanging on the wall, you'd see that it asks a question. It says, what is structure, right? It uses letters to do it. But if we were to look closer at this artwork, let's zoom in here, then you will see that actually these are not letters at all. It's again that same question, what is structure, right? And if I were to zoom into it again, you will see that actually these are not letters. They are again that same structure of the question of what is structure, right? And so what I'm trying to do with this particular artwork, what is the kind of the idea, that's kind of my style of art, is I always call it like, I make like philosophical art, is my particular thing that I usually make. And so I'm asking a question, but I'm using letters here to ask the question sort of on one level. So that's one way of using one structure, letters, to ask a question. But then you could say that the artwork itself, by how I structured it, asks that same question in a very different way, right? It lets you experience the problem. It lets you experience the question of, well, what is structure? Well, yeah, if you ask that question, well, what is structure? Well, yeah, well, that's like saying, what is structure, right? That's kind of the mystery of structure, is that we don't quite understand what structure fundamentally is. If you want to, if you're a bit familiar with Eastern philosophy, for example, it's a bit like saying it's turtles all the way down, right? What is structure? Well, yeah, it's structures, it's shapes that make shapes, but then when you zoom in, you get shapes making the shapes that you were looking at before, just in a different way, and it's like it's all the way down, right? So it's a mystery, right? And so the question of what keeps breaking things in the Vendee globe, when we use words to ask that question, like I could make a different artwork asking that particular question in a different way, right? Like that artwork is not only, like when you look at this artwork that asks what is structure, it's not just a question, the entire artwork actually sort of answers the question. It presents you a structure that both, you know, asks the question what is structure and sort of wonders about what this question is. Like I'm describing it almost in like a multi-dimensional way where you go, yeah, it's beyond the ability of words, of letters, to describe it, right? So I'm trying to show you a meaning that is beyond the ability, now we're getting a bit meta here, of words to describe. And so what I'm going to describe to you today, that's why I'm using this artwork to introduce this concept, I'm going to try to describe to you a structure, which is the answer to the question that we're asking today, that literally is beyond the ability for words to describe. That's why it's quite complicated to actually show you something, because I'm going to use words to describe it, but I can't do it perfectly. So I have to use several different means in order to kind of show you something, right? So I was talking earlier about the laws of physics, right? Like the law of relativity that was discovered by Einstein, the laws of thermodynamics, Newton's laws of gravity. These are just like this question, what is structure? So we describe these rules, these laws, these structures. We can describe them using words, like a story. We can describe them using equations, using numbers and math structures, right? But those are just descriptions. Those are just different ways of sort of showing what we understand, of showing a structure. But just like asking the question, what is structure, only using words, it's very imperfect. It's not a perfect way of actually revealing what we're talking about, right? So I'm going to try to show you the answer to the question, why does stuff keep breaking? Now, using words, but remember, don't get lost in focusing on the words. Don't look at the words. Think about what I mean with the words, because that is what I'm going to try to show you, right? I hope that you're following me here. So, here's the first part. In order for anything to be true. Now, for the word true, I could also say for it to work or to be effective or to be real, right? And for the first part, in order for anything, I could also say for any rule or for any sweater or any structure or any object. Like you can substitute anything literally for anything. It applies to anything. So in order for any rule, let's say for now to help us understand, in order for any rule to be true, yes, and for true, I could also, instead of the words true, I could put, for example, a picture of, let's say, Pamela Anderson when she was first in Baywatch. Because to me, as a 14-year-old boy, watching Baywatch for the first time, she was like a picture of a perfect woman, So it's like true, perfect. You can use words to describe it, but you can also use a picture to describe it. Like if you think a certain painting is perfect, use that, right? I'm not talking about this particular word. I'm trying to show you what I mean, right? So in order for any rule to be true, to be effective, to work, to fit, there must be an exception. Okay. Now you're looking at this particular structure, this particular rule, this particular law, this particular tool, whatever you want to call it, whatever I'm trying to describe, and you're saying, Flor, this is a paradox, because if there must be an exception, then nothing can be true. Wrong. Because this is the only exception. And that's why this, I believe, is the most fundamental rule, the most fundamental structure, the only exception to everything else. This is simultaneously the only true rule because it is the exception, right? So this is the only structure, the only rule that actually can be true. But that means that all the other ones, there must be at least one exception to. So Newton's laws, the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, etc. Every rule, in order for it to work, in order for it to be true, there must be an exception. And this structure, again, don't get lost in the words. It's something that I'm trying to describe to you. It's a structure that I'm trying to describe. Explains why we cannot have, why you can't have an unsinkable ship, why you cannot have a sail hook that never breaks, or material that never wears down, etc. It's because of this structure. So let me prove it to you by using some examples. Let's take math, just as a good example to sort of really show what I mean. So numbers are a tool. They are a structure. They are, they're an object. They are real, right? They are a system. So math is a system, a structure that uses, numbers. And in numbers, we have something that we call prime numbers. What are prime numbers? Well, essentially, all of the numbers, they obey certain rules, certain structures. What is structure? See, it's quite complicated what I'm talking about. But there are certain numbers that defy all the rules, all the operations that work for all the other ones. Why? Because for any system, for math, for example, to work, there must be an exception. Nothing breaks this central rule. Nothing breaks this rule. Nothing can defy this law, this structure. And so we find that we have prime numbers, and people have, waned away. Mathematicians have, gone crazy thinking about what is the essence of prime numbers. Why are they there? Why do we have certain numbers that just show up kind of in random places that you can only divide by themselves or one, right? And you can't divide them by anything else. That there are all kinds of mathematical operations that you cannot do with them, right? They're weird. Why? Because their essence is that they are the exception. And in any system, there must be an exception. And so there's nothing to them except the fact that they are the exception. Pi, same thing. Pi is a number that we can use for different things. But the essence of pi is that it's a number that defies structure. There is no structure to it. No matter how many decimals and numbers you calculate it to, there's no logic, no individual structure, nothing that lets you grasp it. There's no structure. Why? Because it's the exception. It must be, right? If we look at a completely different field, let's take music. So if we look at the European music system, for example, we have the 12-note system, right? So there are only 12 notes in the European system. In the Eastern system, there's different notes, right? But every system, in order to work, must have an exception. So if we look at a piano here, you can see, okay, there are actually only 12 notes. So that's this kind of block here. And this block repeats. But you can see that this block is not perfect. There's kind of a weird, strange thing happening here. And it's not symmetrical in the center. It's kind of in the place where you would expect a prime number. Why? Because in every system there must be an exception. And so in the music system, in order for it to work, to be effective, somehow there must be an exception to it, and it's here. It's missing a sort of step that defies the logic that the rest of the music system adheres to, and it's there. And it's mysterious, it's as unexplained as prime numbers, but it's there, right? Now let me show you in a different way. So I was talking earlier about models, right? So the problem in science that we have, that people say, hey, well, if we know the initial state perfectly, then we can predict what will happen. And one way that we can actually do this is when we take a very big experiment, like we can't know where all the water molecules in the oceans are, so we can't make perfect predictions about what the oceans will do, right? But when we make the experiments really small, what they call kind of quantum science, we get to a point where we can shoot the smallest possible structure that we know of, a photon. What is structure? Well, it's, again, what is structure? The smallest one that we know, the smallest one that we can comprehend, the smallest structure is a photon, you could say, right? And so we can actually shoot one photon, so we have like a big cannon, bad example, but we can shoot one photon exactly where we want. And when we make the experiment that's incredibly small, where we control all the factors, what happens? Something weird. We get an exception. It's impossible for scientists to make an exact prediction where that one photon will land, where that one photon, how it will behave. Why? Because if you could precisely predict where one photon will go, exactly what it will do, that would break this law. You'd have a system without an exception, and that can't be, because you cannot break this law. And so every single experiment that we do on that scale produces an exception. And so the way that science gets around this, which is basically the essence of quantum science, is that we say, well, we can't use the laws of Newton to predict exactly where it goes, but we can assign a probability. So instead of saying, well, we'll shoot the cannon right here, we can make a big circle and say, well, we know the photon is going to land somewhere in this area, but we can't say exactly where. It's the exception. So in Newton's laws, we have an exception because they break down once we get to that smallest level. On the smallest level, we have certain laws, that we could say the laws of quantum physics, let's say, but they break down when you go bigger, and they can't be resolved. And science has been looking for a way to resolve these two. This structure is the way to resolve those two. They are each other's exception, right? Why? Because everything, in order for it to work, for any rule to be true, effective, whatever words you want to use to describe it, there must be an exception. And so once you get this, suddenly you see why you can't make an unsinkable ship, right? The famous example of Titanic. We've made an unsinkable ship. God himself cannot sink this ship, the famous quote. And of course it sank. Why? Because an exception happened. But for the same reason, even if you know the entire initial state, so if you knew where every molecule was, the temperature of everything, the amount of movement, etc., if you knew the perfect initial state of anything, no matter to what scale, no matter how large, even if you know every molecule on planet Earth, and you have unlimited computing power, and you input all the laws of physics and all the different structures that we understand, you still would get the same thing that we get at the smallest level. You'd still get an exception every time, because nothing can break this rule, right? And so I kind of call this concept, if you believe this, if you believe that the laws of science can make a perfect prediction, I call it Titanic thinking, because it's essentially saying, we've made something and God himself cannot sink this ship, right? Like that's kind of the quote, like keep it in your mind, God himself cannot sink this ship, right? And we tend to do that all over the place. It's a way of thinking. So when you ask a question that many of you have asked and say, Flo, why can we not make an Imoca that can't sink? For the same reason that the Titanic sank. You can't make a boat that will never sink, because there must be an exception. You can't make a sailhook that will never break, because there must be an exception. There always, to anything we do, there always must be an exception. It's the central governing structure, law, rule, system, whatever word, again, you want to use to describe this most fundamental structure, let's say, but that is why, right? So once you kind of have this perspective on board, what is structure? There's one fundamental structure, very mysterious, undescribable. You can't really describe it by words, but the essence of it is, in order for anything to work, to be true, to be effective, to exist, to be real, whatever word you want to use, there must always be an exception. And what is an exception? Well, it's the opposite of whatever real is, or whatever effective is, or it's like the moment you create yin, you always will have yang, right? And so we've all known this, we've all heard this before, but many people have never really taken on board this fundamental law as really the thing that governs everything, where you can't break this. Like it's the fundament of everything. This is unbreakable, this particular structure, right? And once you understand that to disbelieve this leads to what I call Titanic thinking, it makes you think that something like an unsinkable ship is possible, God himself cannot sink the ship, then you see that there's actually a lot of Titanic thinking going on when it comes to weather models and people thinking that fundamentally, if you knew the initial state, you could make perfect weather models. No, you can't. But we see also in a lot of engineering fields and different thinking like, well, we could make one way of sourcing energy, like we can make one type of green energy that will always work perfectly, it will never fail. God himself will not sink this ship, right? Or you know what, in Europe, for example, they are banning gas cars and diesel cars, and we must use electric cars for everything. That's the same as saying we have one perfect car, an unsinkable car, the electric car will work for everything. It's exactly the same as saying God himself will not sink this ship, right? And so I'm not saying that any technology is bad or any development is bad. Let's take Conrad Coleman, for example. It's a great example, right? He is doing a Vendee Globe without a diesel engine to find out if it's possible, right? So that's an exceptional idea, and it's a great experiment, right? There's nothing wrong with experimenting and seeing if that is possible. This is a great idea. But you could say that the opposite of Titanic thinking is, maybe Vendee Globe thinking is a good way to name it. And so if Conrad would have a lightning strike, like what happened to Boris Herman, for example, he'd be toast, right? Because he doesn't have any other systems on board, so he'd lose all electricity. He doesn't have a diesel engine to help him out then to kind of regenerate any of his electrical systems, so he'd be dead in the water, right? That would be the exception that would just kill his race right there. So Vendee Globe thinking means don't exclude anything, develop everything you possibly can to the highest possible level, take on board any system, within the rules of the weight limits and stuff that you can bring as many spares as you can, and then, expect there to be all kinds of exception and make your way through. That's how you win. Take on board every system, have as many spares, as many alternatives as you can, do the highest level on everything that you can, and then you might win a Vendee Globe. That's the only way to win. But you can also do other things like saying, hey, could we do it just based on electrics, for example? And as an exception, sure, it's definitely possible to do it. But it's probably impossible to actually win because there are so many exceptions that could happen when you'll just get killed, right? And so in a way, it's the same as thinking like, well, what is the best way to run a society? Well, with Vendee Globe thinking. Take on every possible technological development, develop every technology you can think of to the maximum that you can, because then you will be prepared for every possible exception, because every possible exception can and will inevitably happen, right? So this is kind of Titanic thinking, which leads to questions of why haven't we yet developed a boat, an Imoca that can't sink, a sail that can never break, a sail hook that can never break, electrical systems that will never fault. All this type of thinking comes from the fundamental flaw that there's anything you can exclude, or that there's any exception that cannot happen, right? So it's a fundamental sort of fault that I think snuck into scientific thinking because the structures that we know now, the laws of thermodynamics, the law of relativity, etc., because they work so nearly perfectly, not perfectly, but nearly perfectly, many people have come to mistakenly believe that they're infallible. And if we only know the initial state perfectly, then we can make perfect predictions. And I believe fundamentally that because this is the only exception to all rules, it's the only one true structure, and for anything to be true, for any rule to work, there must be an exception, right? Because that is the real fundamental governing structure of everything, it leads to faulty thinking. And it leads to the idea of God himself cannot sink this ship, or that it would even be possible to make anything that is unsinkable, right? And that leads to stupid decisions everywhere. So I hope that this idea has gotten across. It's very complicated to kind of grasp it, and so don't get hung up on the exact wording. It's not about the words, it's about understanding the structure underneath, which, like I said, it's impossible to describe this structure perfectly. You can try to do it using math. I've tried to do it now using words, because that's what most people understand better than, you know, equations. But yeah, I hope you understand what I intend to sort of show you. And I hope that it will, you know, that it's something that you can take on board, experiment with. I've been understanding this for, let's say, 10 years or so ago, that I kind of intuited this particular, that I sort of saw this, that I had my first sort of look at, hey, I think this is a structure that is real, that exists, that is underneath everything, governing everything. Nothing at all can break this rule. And it simultaneously makes everything possible, and at the same time it makes nothing impossible. So it's kind of the ultimate paradox, but it's the only paradox that's actually possible. In order for any rule to be true, there must be an exception, and this particular one structure is simultaneously the only possible exception to that, making it the only rule that's actually fully, completely exceptional and true. It's the only exception to itself, which is both impossible and possible at the same time, right? So, like, that's why it's very hard to explain it, and why I, you know, have to run sort of several circles in order to kind of sort of show the contours of it. But that's what I wanted to show you, and that's my answer to the question of why can't we have an Imoca that will never break, etc. So it's impossible, while at the same time it could happen that we have a Vendee Globe where everybody finishes without breaking a single thing, and everybody finishes in first place at the exact same time all together at once. So everybody is first, you know, that's possible. Because there is an exception to every rule, right? And so every participant could win the Vendee Globe at the exact, doing the race in the exact same time and having broken nothing. It's possible, at the same time it isn't. See how crazy paradoxical this particular idea is, but that's kind of what makes it really cool, that it defies explanation, yet and it's perfectly circular and exclusionary. At the same time, it makes everything that we do, that we see in life, possible, because everything is simultaneously the rule and the exception. Super weird, right? Super meta, super crazy. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this explanation. You know, take your time to watch this several times if you need to kind of grasp what I'm saying. Please don't be too critical in the or let's not attack each other in the comments. I intend this as an idea to be explored, to be understood, to, you know, broaden your appreciation of life and art and of what, you know, a Vendee Globe can give you. Because this is why I particularly love the Vendee Globe, because it's a great metaphor for life, right? People have been practicing for the Vendee Globe sometimes for 20 years, have been training, have been getting ready, have been developing systems to get through this ultimate of ultimate tests. And still, they can't predict every inevitability because it's just impossible, right? So it's like an ultimate test, and you could say the people that failed the race this time, so people like Pip Hare and Ionic Besthaven, you know, who didn't manage to actually finish the race. Are they the exception, or are the people that are actually finishing the race the exception? Well, it can be true for both of them, right? So weird, interesting, paradoxical at the same time, but I think the only true structure underneath everything. So I hope that this, you know, for forever and always has answered your fundamental question and curiosity about why can't we make something that works perfectly? Because it is impossible, and that is actually, I believe, a scientifically provable idea, because in order for anything to be true, there must be an exception. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Please like and subscribe, and see you in the next one. Ciao, wolves!